all that
Lester
stuff.
Holt's going to talk about you on the news.
Lester
Holt, is he going to introduce you on the news?
He introduced the dog of the dog show today.
Oh, yeah.
I watched that little snippet they had about that hockey player that collapsed.
Yeah.
That was really weird. He was in that smoky, yeah.
Hey, Dave.
Thought he'd come and so there would be an audience of just
Well, thank you.
They have hi Winston.
I didn't know whether you would come.
Of course. And I brought Paul, and I hope he's not a nuisance. Because he gets a little crazy sometimes.
Oh, okay.
I'm like, I have to warn Winston. Just in case.
I didn't have a chance to look at it.
Anyway, Myrna and Karki have 8 grandchildren.
Wow.
They had 4, and then in 1 year.
5 minutes
they
to
had
go, Ernie.
4.
It'll start at 6:30, and I got about. Although I run a little bit fast.
well, I gotta go.
Yeah, you know that.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So, yeah, she's doing good. She's still doing all of her, crafts and quilting. So she actually got me into quilting, so I made a few quilts.
I have to tell some things on Winston.
That would be good. Maybe he'd help you. Tell a couple more.
He'll tell a few things on himself, I'm sure.
Yeah. Well, I had sort of a couple different stages of my life. The first stage I don't talk about too much.
As soon as
And I assume for good reason.
Yes, it is.
Well, I think we all have stories like that.
Yeah.
He reveal secrets.
Yeah, he probably will. He won't give it. He won't tell me. Oh, this is Carolyn Twingley.
Hi.
And she and Nancy Springer
Oh.
are very good friends, and we haven't seen each other.
Carolyn graduated from high school with my brother,
Oh, okay.
so I've known her forever.
So you're Bismarck native, huh?
Absolutely.
Her brother was Bob Heskin, that was the mayor.
Oh, sure. I remember
Oh, you
Bob
were. I
Heskin.
think I kind of remember that now.
And he was married to Harold's daughter?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay.
Still is.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah.
Sick. Where's Arnie?
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you want me to work this seating arrangement right now?
Well,
See,
Well,
my purse is over there next to Jolene. She said.
yeah, I'll sit over there.
we're waiting
Oh.
for.
Yeah.
Okay, then Arnie can sit someplace else.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're going to introduce me? I get to stand up?
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a present for the Historical Society. We've been cleaning house. We found an opening brochure for the Kirkwood Plaza. Pictures and everything.
Okay, I don't know if you know the Sacristans.
John.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, no, this would be the brother and his family. What's his first name?
No, I
Anyway,
don't.
his daughter Emily wanted to do an update on what's going on with the railroad bridge, but she's not here yet, so I'm just gonna
Okay.
have to get ready to go here. Carolyn, can you count for me? Because we're supposed to do that. Once we get going. All right. All of a sudden, they got quiet.
Did you ready to talk.
Must be my beautiful presence up here.
Charismatic.
I'm not sure how exactly I got talked into doing this part of it, but since I have the biographical information, I guess I'm going to be the one here. So my name is Ann Badney. I'm the board of directors for the Bismarck Historical Society. And we have our executive director here, wherever he wants. Okay, we don't have him here?
He's here, but he's not here.
Okay, and our president, sitting over there in the blue sweatshirt, is Marilyn Schneider, and a couple of our other board members. So welcome. I would like to introduce to you Winston Satrom. His home community was, he graduated from Mulhall High School in 1959. He attended college at Minot State for 2 years. Then he served in the Army from 1964 to 1966. He was employed at Dakota Boys Ranch in Minot for 2 years as a dorm counselor and attended and graduated from the University of Minnesota after serving in the Army and was employed in Minnesota. Returned to North Dakota upon graduation and became employed by Vocational Rehabilitation as a pre-release counselor for inmates at the state penitentiary. After 3 years as a counselor, he was appointed as deputy warden at the age of 30. Served as deputy warden for 7 years, then was employed as a warden for 7 years until 1986. Then he became the director of Home on the Range, a residential facility for children in the western North Dakota for 11 years. Then employed by the Theodore Roosevelt Medora Foundation as vice president in charge of operations in Medora. Also served as a consultant for the Teddy Roosevelt Medora Foundation for 2 years as a consultant to middle managers. Do you want me to read that?
What's that? Yeah, that's the truth.
I did not like being unemployed.
Couldn't hold a job as
Yeah.
And was appointed as director of the Horse Racing Commission for the state of North Dakota. Retired at the age of 72, married to Barbara, his lovely wife, Barbara Lund, for 51 years. He has 2 daughters, Julie and Shelley, sons-in-law, Darwin and Kent, and 5 grandchildren. Sounds kind of like my dad now. Anyway, welcome, Winston.
Thank you. Thank you, Ann, for doing that. I like the flourish with your arm there for us. Made it more dramatic. Ann was right. I began working at the North Dakota State Penitentiary as a pre-release counselor, and I was employed by Vocational Rehabilitation. And at that time, money came flowing into the states to do something about offenders and try and plan for their release. And that was my job, find them jobs or find them education. And I did that for 3 years. One of the kind of benefits out of it is I volunteered to be the advisor for the Alcoholics Anonymous group. And Chuck Enders, who had been the sole social worker, set up a wonderful alcohol education program for the inmates. And I wished everybody could have heard Dr. Saxfig, Dr. Gardebring, the 2 Larson brothers from State Alcohol Division. We had some of the staff from Hartview come over. It was the most in-depth education you could get, and the inmates were so fortunate to hear that. I was appointed deputy warden at age 30, and it was kind of I think they were just hoping this guy would work out. There were lots of things going on at the penitentiary. There was a lot of chaos going on. Warden Woodley was relieved of his duties. The deputy warden went to work for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and So they brought in a recently retired federal warden, a fellow named Andy Harris. And Mr. Harris had been the warden of Leavenworth, which was the largest federal prison in the United States at that time, and he had just retired, and so he came to help North Dakota out through this transition period. I didn't even really know him. I would see him in the hallway, and I would say hello, and that was about it. And one day he said to me, Winston, I'd like to come over to your house tonight and have dinner with you. I thought that was kind of abrupt, and I said, well, do you mind if I call my wife Barb? And she said, absolutely no, but she did say yes, and I had shot a pheasant a few days before that, and it must have been one of the oldest ones in the state of North Dakota, because when we ate the pheasant, it was like chewing leather, but it didn't seem to bother Mr. Harris too much. And I forgot to mention, he was really a noted fellow. He had been one of Patton's lead tank commanders in the Battle of the Bulge. He had played professional baseball for a number of years. He was really a remarkable man. So after we got done eating, we went into the living room and we had a little short chit-chat, and he said, tomorrow I want to recommend you to the Director of Institutions to be the Deputy Warden. And I thought, what? I had absolutely no experience as being an administrator of a prison. And so he talked me through this thing and thought I had the capabilities of doing it. Obviously, he had been observing me, and the prison was really in chaos. The year before that Warden Woodley left his job, there were 28 walkaways and escapes. So that told you about the security in the prison. And it was a monumental task. Mr. Harris stayed with me for 6 weeks, then he left, and a new warden was appointed, Bob Landon, who was a retired Army colonel, and he had just recently got out of the service, and he had been in the military police almost his whole career. And Bob Landon was kind of a George Patton. He walked with a flair, and Wanda, who's sitting in the back of the room, will remember him. He never put his arms in his coat sleeves. He just put it around his shoulder, and he walked with military precision. When he would turn, and his coat would flare out, and he what'd you say? Yes, it looked like a cape, and he drew attention to himself, but he was actually a good warden. He started to communicate with inmates, and he came to me, and 4 inmates had wanted to see him, and at that time, across the country, there was starting to be prison rodeos. Texas had a prison rodeo, Louisiana had one, Arkansas had one, Arizona had tried one for a couple of years, and Utah had it one or 2 years. And so these inmates approached him and said, we would like to have a prison rodeo. Without him consulting with anybody, said, I'm going to approve that. And he came out to my office and he said, we're going to have a prison rodeo. And I said, Warden, I don't know anything about prison rodeo. You're from New York. You don't know anything. And he said, not only are we going to have a rodeo, but you're going to organize it and you're going to manage the rodeo, and there's no state funding in the rodeo. And so that's the way the prison rodeo got started. And it grew from just struggling. I remember the receipts the first year when we finished the rodeo, we had $140 left over after we paid every bill. And it was really a terrible time in my life because I wouldn't pay the inmates' prize money until we had paid every bill. And after we got them paid, then I paid the inmates their prize money. And they made life miserable for me. They thought I was cheating them out of the money, but we eventually paid them. And with that $140, we started the rodeo for the next year. And it actually grew to 7,000 people over 2 days would come into the prison the last few years. And it gained national attention and international attention. And two writers, a writer and a photographer, came from France. And I had a couple of these, and unfortunately I gave away the good one. It's called VSD, Friday, Saturday, Sunday was the name of the magazine. And they produced a 5-page article, and it gained so much popularity that 40 different news agencies in Europe picked up this story. This fellow right here happened to be a federal prisoner we had, and he was in the witness protection program. And it was hard to hide him. He was coming from a motorcycle gang on the East Coast, and there were a lot of murders committed, and he gave lots of information. But he was 7 foot tall and he weighed 400 pounds, so it was hard to hide him. This was an inmate leaving the chute, and he obviously didn't have a good hold on the bareback rigging because it's kind of the first jump out of there. And then this fellow was a guy that was in and out of prison quite a number of times, but when he wasn't in prison, he was a cowboy. And we did something probably that not many people would approve of, but he could break horses. And we would lease bucking horses. And if Gary saw kind of an exceptional horse, he would break it for the stock contractor. Not that the stock contractor wanted it broke, but he made a saddle horse out of it, and that word got spread around. And we set it up so that people could bring their horses in there inside the pen, and Gary would break them. And it was a different twist. But we had all the standard rodeo events: saddle bronc riding, bull riding, bareback riding, steer wrestling, calf roping, but we did something extra. Our first event was Mad Scramble, 6 bulls, 6 riders, and we turned them all loose at once. And it was kind of save your soul when you got bucked off. About in the middle of the rodeo, we had an event called the Hard Money, and stock contractor had big fighting bulls, big large horns, and there was a ribbon tied right on the center of the horn, and whoever got that ribbon off won the prize money. And some years the bull totally won, nobody got it off. A lot of inmates flew in the air, but there was some spectacular courage by the inmates. We ended the rodeo with a wild horse race. You had 6 horses in the chutes, all of them wild, and they had a halter on them with a long rope, and the inmates had 3-man teams, and they had to we turned all the horses loose at once, and the inmates had to snub the horse down, get a saddle on him, ride him across the finish line. And obviously there was lots of action in the rodeo arena. And the crowds loved it. They just absolutely loved it. I didn't so much because I was responsible, and we had a number of broken bones and some blood spilled and a lot of stitches in guys. But it worked really well for us. It was a tough time, tough budgets, and now that I look back, it created a bond between the staff and the inmates, And I ran all of the practices. Later on, we started getting bucking horses 6 weeks before the rodeo, and we would have practices, and I would go out and round up the horses and bring them into the pen and get them ready for the inmates to ride. And it developed a new bond between each of the inmates and myself. There were lots of events going on. When I first went into the prison, I remember the very first time I went in there as a vocational rehabilitation counselor, I thought it was a 1940s movie set. That's the way it seemed to me. And it was like a Jimmy Cagney movie. That's all I could think of. And there were basically no programs, a very small work program, and there was not even a gymnasium at that time. So in the wintertime, the inmates went to their cells and they were basically locked up for the evening. So we began to look at things, and one of the first things we began to look at was treatment programs for the inmates. What could we do? When they got out of the prison, one of the things we felt obligated about was we need to protect North Dakota citizens. It was our obligation. So we started to take a look at drug and alcohol addiction, and I recall 83% of the inmates had involvement in drug and alcohol abuse, and many of them committed the crimes. And I'm going to talk to you about 3 crimes that made me really think about whether this program was worth it. A fellow from the eastern part of the state, he was a car salesman. He started drinking a lot, got divorced, kept drinking a lot, and one weekend he went on a binge, rented a motel room, and somehow he got involved with a teenage girl. And they drank Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and he was in such a haze, they started playing Russian roulette, and he pulled the trigger and he shot and killed the girl. And he got a manslaughter charge. And he came to prison, and once he got sobered up, he had lived, prior to his drinking, a pretty normal life. He was scared to death in prison. I recall talking to him a number of times, and he told me how he was frightened every day. And we learned so many things. While we were doing this, we didn't start out as experts. We started out learning things. What do we have to do? And we found there were different aspects to drug and alcohol abuse. A fellow that lived in a community where there was tremendous drug and alcohol use. And I used to ask inmates about the circumstances of their crimes. And this fellow had gone to work Friday afternoon, got paid, stopped, cashed his check, stopped at the bar, got drunk, came home, and his wife was angry with him. Dinner was waiting for him. The kids were sitting around the table, and they started arguing, and they were in the kitchen, and he picked up a knife and stabbed her right above the heart. And the kids ran out of the house, ran next door, and the police were called. He pulled the knife out, and he told me he tried to hold her to stop the bleeding. She died. And after he told me this story, I said, well, what did you think about all of those circumstances? And this was one of the cues to me that the education we had to do. He said, it was one of those drunken things. That was he was so naive about the actual effects of alcohol, what it was doing to his personality, that he just saw it as a drunken thing. I wasn't really responsible, I was just drunk. We had another fellow that came into prison, and he had been in Vietnam, and he was with a combat unit, and every time they were scheduled to go out on a mission, he faked injuries, he faked illness, and basically he considered himself a coward. He couldn't face up to it. And he got out of the service, small town in North Dakota. He was using drugs heavily. He got started with drugs in Vietnam, and he was using drugs. He drove by the high school. It was at noontime. He saw a very pretty girl. He stopped and asked her for a date. He told me his hair was sticking all over. He had a beard, dirty t-shirt on. She didn't know him and said, absolutely not. And that evening, he broke into the local hardware store, and he stole a .243 caliber deer rifle and a box of shells. And he knew where she lived on a farm, and he went out, walked into the house, like most of us in North Dakota grew up. We didn't lock our doors out in the country. And he walked in, and he walked into the parents' bedroom. His intention was to rape this girl, but he walked into the parents' bedroom. It was dark, and the wife said to her husband, there's somebody in here, and he started to get up, and he shot him right in the forehead with the .243 caliber rifle. And the mother jumped out of the bed screaming, and he turned around, started to walk out, and he shot and hit the door jamb right beside her, and splinters flew into her face. She thought she was shot, and she ran down and threw herself over the two girls. He walked out, got in the car, drove down the road, threw the rifle out, and about 3 days later, it wasn't hard to figure out who had done it. They arrested him. He came to prison, and I was in a therapy session when the counselor was talking to him about this, and his reason for killing the person is because he had been a coward in Vietnam and he had never killed anybody. So all of this thinking got distorted. People get really distorted thinking, and he thought he wasn't a man unless he had killed somebody. But he killed an innocent father of two girls and a wife. And so we had to do something about this. It was, and one of the things when you work at the penitentiary, and Wanda and Paul certainly know this, you have to steel yourself. You can't pass judgment on the people coming into the penitentiary. You can't let that enter your mind. You have to deal with the person there because you're obligated by law to take care of them, provide medical services to keep them safe. And so not only that, but we had to provide services to get them healthy so when they got out of prison, they wouldn't do those things. Our alcohol and drug unit started to grow and become more sophisticated, and we became the first alcohol and drug treatment, accredited treatment program in any prison in the United States. And we were very proud of that. It was a tremendous achievement. I don't know whether it's still functioning that way or not, but I recall all of the work that went into that. Then we started a sex offender program, and we had the same motivation. People came to prison because they had committed horrendous crimes. And I'm going to tell you a couple of those crimes. And there were always twists to things. Why did this happen? And you could look at the person and be extremely judgmental, but as you unpeel the onion, you found out there was more to it than what you originally just looked on the court papers. This fellow came in, he had married a woman from North Dakota. She had two small girls, I think they were 2 and 3. He was from another state, he got married. They got married, she was working, he was staying home with the girls, and he sexually molested those 2 little girls, 2 and 3-year-olds. And he came to prison, and he got involved with, maybe some of you remember Dr. Gardebring. He was our part-time psychologist, and Dr. Gardebring did quite a bit of work with him. And this fellow had what was termed loosely as alligator skin. And I only met 2 people with this. He had checkered, scaly skin on the back of his arms and on his back. And that was from vitamin deficiencies when he was a small kid. And one of the things that excited him sexually was the smell of urine. And Dr. Gardebring, I remember after doing lots of work with him, figured out that he was so deprived when he was a child, the only time that he was warm was when he urinated in his diaper, and that somehow triggered some sexual response later on. And when he smelled these 2 girls' diapers, he got sexually aroused. Now, I tell you that story because we were getting into complicated business, and we had a wonderful programs department, and they dove headlong into that. And we tried to figure out things to stop these things. Another fellow came to prison, kind of a nice looking guy, middle 40s, and he had committed a vicious rape. He not only raped the woman, he took a cigarette, burned her breasts a number of times, made her kneel, and he urinated in her face. So here we are. We could sit there and say we're just a security institution and not do anything, or we could try and do something so these people wouldn't serve their time and commit the same kind of offenses. And that's the stance we took, and we worked very hard at that. Bob Landon was at the prison for 20 months, and he went to the state of Virginia, and he actually became the director of corrections there. And then a warden was hired named Joseph Havener. And Joe had been with the DC Department of Corrections, started out at the very bottom, and he ended up becoming the assistant director of the DC Department of Corrections. And Joe retired from there. He went to Alabama and worked for a year. He worked for Denver City Jail for a year. It was more kind of a consultant role. And then he took a job in Ohio in just a terrible prison. And he worked there 3 years, and then he came to us. And Joe was not an inmate guy. He didn't get out into the prison. And Joe didn't have a lot of ambition, but he had credibility. He carried himself well, had good rapport with the legislature, so he did lots of things that added to it. He wasn't ambitious. One time his wife said to me, "Winston, you're the luckiest man in the world." And I said, "How so, Pat? You work for one of the laziest men, and you're going to learn the most that you've ever learned in your life." And Wanda's laughing because she knows. So I was fortunate. He wasn't an inmate man. One morning I was getting ready for the rodeo. I'd been over the prison at 4 o'clock in the morning, and I came outside of the prison to go over to the shop to get something. It was 7 o'clock, and Joe was putting his golf clubs in the car. I knew he wasn't too interested in what was going on, but he did come to the rodeo anyway. But things happened, and now I look back, it was a tremendous learning experience. It was a hard learning experience. I became warden after Joel Havener left, and I was on a 9-month honeymoon. A lot of managers get a honeymoon for a period of time, 9 months. I thought, oh my goodness, this job's easy. Everything's going right. Then kind of the floor caved in on us. We had our first suicide that we had in 15 years at the penitentiary. And it was a fellow that had been drunk, ran over two 10-year-old girls walking down the street, killed them, and he became mentally ill, and he hung himself one Saturday evening. That triggered other suicides. Then in the next 9-month period, we had 3 suicides. I couldn't tell you how many attempts we had. And so what did we do? What do we do about this psychological phenomena that was going? And we hired a fellow named Robert Brooks, who was a national expert on suicide prevention in jails and prisons. And Robert Brooks was quite a man. He had been a Marine Corps officer, led 2 combat tours in Vietnam, and when he got out of the service, he said, where can I be of service to people? And he noticed that there were many suicides in prisons and jails across the country. And he started studying and got a master's degree. And he went around and then became a consultant. We brought Mr. Brooks up 3 times to the penitentiary to train our staff. The 3rd time he was up there, it was late in the evening in my office, and I said, let's go for a walk, Bob. So we walked east past the penitentiary and out a ways in one of those beautiful North Dakota evenings, just perfect temperature. And I stopped, he stopped, and I said, Bob, what are we doing wrong? What's happening here? Because not only the successful suicides, it triggered other suicides attempts. And for the longest time, he just stared at me, didn't take his eyes off me. And then he said to me something that just devastated me. He said, I think you're doing too many things right. Oh, too many things right. You've started too many programs. Your work program is going great. You have great recreation. You're doing too many things right. It felt like he slugged me in the guts. And I said to him, explain that. He said, well, most inmates come into prison. They're angry people. And when they come into prison, there are things they can be angry about. You've diminished that. You've taken a lot of these things away, and they no longer can be angry at the staff. They can't be angry at the programs. They can't be angry at the work program. And there was no answer for that. We had worked all these years implementing these programs and doing the right thing, and then it triggered this phenomena. But we did do some things. And I don't know who came up with the idea. I like to think I came up with the idea, but I'm probably not sure about that. We took people who were graduated out of our therapy sessions, and we made 8 2-man teams, and they were crisis intervention teams, and they were trained by our staff. And so if somebody we thought was threatening suicide or indicated to another inmate that they were suicidal, we had a little psychiatric ward. It was actually 4 cells up in our little hospital. And we would put these fellows on there for 6-hour periods, and then another crew would come on for 6 hours, another crew, until the crisis passed. And Mr. Brooks taught us about 85% of the suicides that happen are transcendental thoughts. They just move on past a person. And if you can get them past that period, it's gone away and they're not going to commit suicide. And we implemented that program, and I think, Wanda, is it still going at the prison? Do you know, Paul?
It was in 2015.
Okay, so that was a good program. So how did we get the inmates to do that? And inmates get good time. If they have good behavior, they get so many days a month off their sentence. And there's some provisions in the good time law. If they do exceptional things, they get more good time. So we paid the inmates with good time. They got out of their cells, they were doing something productive, and they actually got paid in good time. And it turned out was a great relief to me because we would put pressure on the officers, check on this guy every 15 minutes. Well, the officer gets involved in something else and he can't go check on the person. So it put a strain on everybody. And once we implemented that program, the strain went away. One of the other things that we approached is we had just a meager spiritual program. And we started a part-time chaplaincy program, and Father Blaine Cook helped us get that started. And then we moved to Father Eckroth. And finally, we got the major churches in North Dakota to contribute to that. It couldn't be paid by the state. You can't mix religion and state funds. And so they paid for a full-time chaplain. And even though he conducted spiritual services, one of the benefits of that in AA and Narcotics Anonymous, the fifth step is you are to confess all your wrongs to yourself, to God, and to somebody else. And they felt comfortable with the chaplain doing that. So the chaplain took part in our AA program, and it was really beneficial that we didn't have somebody that was viewed as part of our staff that would keep things private, and they could tell all of the past incidents in their lives and get them off their chest. Then this young lady right here in the blue vest, Ingrid Omlid, she came to us, and we had started a psychological testing of all the inmates. Seems like it would be pretty commonplace, but it's a massive job, and not only do you have to do the psychological testing, you have to interpret it, and Ingrid worked with our people in our therapy, and she worked with Dr. Gardebring and Dr. Thacker, and told the results, and it made a huge difference because we were learning that people might suffer from alcoholism, but we found out through the testing that there were underlying psychological problems that really complicated, and they were using alcohol or drugs to medicate themselves when they actually had really severe psychological problems. And we expanded that, and I always smile when I think about this because we started testing then employees that applied at the penitentiary. So we would have the testing, and Ingrid would come into my office, and we would have a number of candidates, and I would say, Ingrid, this guy really looked good. She'd kind of shake her head, no. And I said, hey, he really had a good interview, and I liked his background. No. And she saved me from making mistakes with people, making mistakes of hiring people that had psychological problems that their prison environment would have brought out. So I thank you. Ingrid, I can remember sitting across the room and you're shaking your head, no? No? And it was good. One of the things I should mention that there are people around you that make you do a better job. And back in the back of the room, Wanda, please stand up. Wanda was my administrative assistant through deputy warden and warden, and Wanda made me a good warden. She took care of me, kept me on schedule, made me do things, cleaned up my grammar. She was my right and left arm, and her husband, Paul, was a correctional officer at the penitentiary. But I couldn't do this alone. Barb and I had 2 children, and we've been married for 51 years. And I worked lots of hours, and I could feel comfortable because Barb never put any pressure on me to be at home. I spent hours and hours at the penitentiary, and I couldn't have done that if I would have had a different wife that said, you have to be home at this time. We have to do this thing. She supported me 100%. We did other things. Our work program was almost non-existent. We had lots of people in their cells. The only time they got out was to eat, go to recreation. And so we did some things that were revolutionary with our industries program. We selected a fellow named Jim Johnson. He was a retired Marine sergeant. He worked for us, and he had had a lot of experience in that kind of organizing things. And Jim and I went to the state of Texas, and they had a massive industry program. We started taking a look at it, and we started to figure out what we could do in North Dakota. But we did it different than Texas. We actually changed the law and said we're going to become like a private industry, and all of the employees were no longer getting paid by the state, even though they were state employees. All their salaries came out of the industries program. All the inmates pay, and we paid the inmates on quality and quantity, and they learned a lot of skills in our industries, and all the equipment was purchased out of the industries program. And so we started furniture manufacturing that we could sell to public and charitable institutions. We made janitorial products, we made highway and city signs, we made metal products, and we took and folded in our agricultural operation. The penitentiary managed 6,000 acres, and we had a beef herd. And when we folded that in, and we were always short of money, wondering, are we going to get another contract? And we had 98 steers, and 6 miles east of Bismarck, the penitentiary owned some land, and it was the winter time. We didn't know how we were going to pay the industry's payroll, and the beef herd manager and another guy that was kind of a cowboy went down there on horseback, and we herded those 98 steers into Missouri Slope livestock ring, sold the steers, and we paid for the industry operations for about 3 months. That's how close it was at times, whether we were going to make it or not make it. But it turned into a really thriving industry. We didn't do this without opposition, because, of course, people in business didn't like what we were doing. The North Dakota Retail Association would come and testify against us at the legislature. We would have to rebut that. The North Dakota Stockmen's Association didn't like it because we moved from a commercial herd to a registered herd, so they didn't like it. The Janitorial Retailers Association testified against it. And what I'm telling you, these things did not come easy. They did not come easy, but they kept progressing. We entered into an agreement with the U.S. Experiment Station just south of Mandan, and that enabled us to expand our herd because they used their pastures, and they would do a grazing experiments with our cattle. So we kept looking for every possible avenue we could to kind of expand what we were doing. One of the things that happened about the time that I became deputy warden, the first people started coming in for selling drugs and marijuana in North Dakota. And it actually really changed the whole demeanor of the penitentiary. We then had to deal with smuggling of drugs into the penitentiary and marijuana. And a week ago, I testified against legalizing recreational marijuana because I saw all of the negative aspects of that. And all of the people that, innocent people on the outside that got involved in the smuggling, and it complicated their lives because they got arrested, caught, and they were being duped into things. And so we started drug testing, and about the same time all this stuff that started happening is the federal court said that every prison in the United States had to have a law library and you had to train law clerks. And the intention was that inmates then could take a look at their arrest, their judicial proceedings, and their sentencing. That was the intention of it. But something else happened. They started suing us. And they sued us over the testing of urine, and went to the North Dakota Supreme Court on 3 different occasions because they'd go to district court, they'd get turned down, they would appeal to the Supreme Court. But other things happened. Native Americans, I thought we had an exemplary program for Native Americans and their spiritual beliefs. We had a sweat lodge, we had a powwow, we allowed speakers to come in, but they sued us, and it went on for 3 years in federal court. And I felt like a farmer that had hail clouds on the horizon every night. That's the way I felt about those suits. And I thought, oh, is this going to cost the state of North Dakota money? And after 3 years, we went to federal court. A federal judge came up from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We had a 3-day trial, and the ACLU had taken up their cause. So it was not an easy court case, and we won after 3 years. We got an acquittal for us. And I went over to the last fellow. The other guys had been discharged from the prison. Their sentences had run out. And so I said to him, Corby, what do you think of the judicial process? Now, this is 3 years being on the front page of the Bismarck Tribune. Prison violates religious rights of Native Americans. And he looked up at me and said, you should have won because we were lying the whole time anyway. 3 years of misery thinking about that. And it tells you something about the difference between criminal nature and ordinary citizens. It was a game for them, and it worked in their behavior. And the ACLU, they were vicious with us. As deputy warden and warden, I was sued 45 times. And we went to court 45 times. And Ed Zern, probably many of you have known Ed Zern in your life. Ed was with the Attorney General's office, and the prison was one of his assignments. And Ed fought for us, and we won 45 cases. We never lost a case. And some of them just didn't stop with federal court. They went to the Circuit Court of Appeals in St. Louis. And it was something I really detested. But after I thought about it for a long time, it was actually a good thing. We were teaching people not how to do things violently or damaging somebody in a certain way. We were teaching them the legal process on how to actually air their grievances. And in the long run, I look back, and it was actually a good thing that happened at the penitentiary. One of the things that we did that was, and I don't know if it was right, but anybody that came into prison that didn't have a high school diploma, educational director, Dennis Jacobs, came to me and said, why don't we say before they can get a job, they have to go through a GED program and get a high school equivalency diploma. So we made that a rule. We started getting 110 GED certificates per year. So when a guy got out of prison, he was equivalent to a high school diploma. Now, some inmates really argued with me that you can't do that, but I said, we'll do it. And it worked. And I remember a fellow that was from up in the Walhalla area, and I talked to Ray, I don't know how many times. Ray, get in the GED program. And he'd been in prison a while. No, I never did well in school. Finally, he got in the GED program. He passed his GED test. And I had him in my office, and he had the biggest smile on his face. And I could tell he was so proud of himself. And he said, Winston, do you know I'm the first person ever in my family to have a high school diploma? That seemed like it was a wonderful thing that happened to Ray. But I'm not done. The big thing, the big things that are going to happen in 1981, and we needed to repair the prison. It was actually falling apart on us. On the west cell house, one warm summer afternoon, about 60 feet long, about 40 feet high, 3 courses of brick just fell out of the wall. If anybody would have been there, it would have killed them. And there was 1 layer of brick between the inmates and freedom. In the middle of the winter, not in November or April, but in the coldest part of the winter, our whole heating plant would go down. The penitentiary's temperature dropped. Our heating plant supplied all the buildings in the complex. Our temperature would be dropping. We'd get the maintenance crew out there. They would work for 4 or 5 hours and get the heating plant running again. We had to replace that. One thing that we didn't even know about, the walls were massive, and they were all made out of bricks laid next to each other. And Arnie and I had to kind of laugh about this. Arnie was our architect from the very beginning right through the end, and we did $24 million worth of renovations. But when we started to take the walls down, inside of the walls, the brick had been made locally, and it was out of a real soft clay. And there had been stucco put on the outside of the walls, water seeped down. There was 1 layer of good brick, and the rest was mud, and 1 layer of good brick on the outside. So if anybody would have known that, they could have dug through that wall in 20 minutes and been out. And when we got the first appropriation, it was for $11,700,000. And Arnie and I made our pitch before the Appropriations Committee in the Senate, and they approved it. Evan Lips was the vice chairman, and he said to us, "You'll be back for more money." And Arnie grew up in Kenmore, North Dakota. I grew up in Mohall, North Dakota, 30 miles apart, 2 kind of small town guys. We made a commitment that we weren't going to exceed the construction allowance. We spent all but $1,700 of that $11.7 million, but we did it through paying attention to things. Arnie, before we even started construction, conducted 245 hours of interviews with the staff and inmates. And what it did was gave a broad view of every little problem in the penitentiary. And Arnie used that to put into the design of the prison. Then we had bi-weekly meetings with the contractors. And I don't know if you're familiar with building, the way contractors make a lot of money is change orders come up, and then they can charge a lot more fees because they're on the job. You can't go get another contractor and come in and get bids on that. So Arnie and I managed that. Every week we had, or every other week we had meetings with the contractors. We approved some of them we denied, some of them we modified, and we held the cost down. And the next contract was for $8 million. The next contract was around $5 million, and it kept the taxpayers from paying excessive amounts. And we saw in other institutions where they had exceeded their contracts tremendously. One of the things that happened is we started to make these renovations, tearing down the walls of the penitentiary. We took all the inmates out in the yard the first morning that the wrecking ball came, and they started in the southeast corner, and the wrecking ball swung and the wall exploded, and we had a provision that they put a fence around it, but I quickly realized that the fence was inadequate. We had an officer out there with a shotgun, and if you know something about the prison business, that's not going to work because people create diversions, and people are going to use that diversion and they're going to escape. And when I came in, I had a sense of dread. Oh my goodness, what's going to happen here? The walls are coming down. We have this thin fence. And I called Ed Zern and I said, Ed, can you come out here right now? Ed came out and I told him what was going on, and we were under the gun. The place was falling apart. The state was short of money. They gave us this $11.7 million. We had to get it done. And all of a sudden, we're at tremendous risk. Ed said, let's look at the good time law. And there were really three provisions. If you had good behavior, you got an automatic so many days off per month, depended on the length of your sentence. There was meritorious good time, and then there was another good time provision based on exemplary work. So Ed said, let's take this, and we came up with a scheme. We doubled everybody's good time with the provision that if there were any escape attempts or escapes, everybody would lose their good time. So I sent a personal letter to every inmate in the institution explaining this. The first period of vulnerability was 12 months. We got through that. The next one was 8 months. We got through that. And actually, we had some of the best behavior that we ever had because they were getting a lot of good time, and we didn't have problems inside the penitentiary. And I haven't told people about that, but after 30-some years I've been gone, I did talk to a lawyer, and I said, will I be arrested?
Statute of limitations.
Yeah, it's over now. So please don't tell anybody about that, though. So these things were happening, and nothing was easy. There was not anything easy about working or being part of the penitentiary staff or being the warden. Nothing came easy. There didn't seem like there were any short periods of just a holiday. Oh my goodness, this feels good. It doesn't. But we did another thing that we haven't told people about. We made a contract with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and we brought witness protection cases. And I showed you John Lewis's picture, the 7-foot tall guy, part of a motorcycle gang. He and another guy, they had not seen, but they heard, and they gave information on 100 murders. 100 murders. And North Dakota, we worked with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. They inspected us time and time again. They had an employee stationed here. He was out to the prison a couple times a week, and they trusted us. But we took some pretty famous people. We took a guy named Billy Wayne Davis that was a member of the Dixie Mafia. And it wasn't the Italian Mafia, but it was a group of people that actually kind of came out of the moonshiners era, and they were vicious criminals. And they murdered 54 people. Billy came to the prison, and they'd committed a bank robbery, so that became a federal charge, and they got charged on that. And Billy started giving information because they were looking at the death penalty in Georgia, and I think he was trying to avoid the death penalty. But the day he came in, I went back to the check-in process, and here's this handsome, well-built guy with perfect Southern manners. Yes, sir. No, sir. Thank you, sir. And knowing Billy was like riding a roller coaster. And I got to know him a little bit. We were having a rodeo practice, and he would come over behind the chutes, and I said, Billy, would you ever like to try and ride a horse? Yes, sir, I would, but I don't know anything about horses. By that time, our rodeo club had bought a bucking machine, and I said, next week, don't eat lunch. I'm going to take you out, and we're going to put you on the bucking machine. And he rode the bucking machine. He was athletic, and after about an hour, he was doing well. And I said, what do you think? He said, put me in all of the horse events. And so things came along with Billy. I opened a large envelope one day, 6 murder indictments against Billy. I thought, oh my goodness. I read each one of those. I remember I got up in my office and I looked out the window, and what kind of world do we live in? But different things happened. A sheriff from Georgia called me and he said, I hear you're keeping Billy Wayne Davis up there. And I said, yes, sir, we are. And he said, well, could you tell him that his wife died last night? So those were always kind of painful duties. I had to tell somebody that a family member died. So I called Billy in, and we had a room that was private. And I said to Billy, I have bad news. Your wife passed away last night. And he wasn't looking at me. And finally he said, how did she die? And I said, a drug overdose. And his eyes just fixed on me. And he said, they killed her, meaning the people that were still out in his gang, they were getting retribution against Billy. So the story about Billy doesn't end there. A few months later, I got a note, and in prison, it's called a kite. We had little pink sheets, and it'd say, to warden, can I see you? Billy Davis. So I thought, I've never heard from Billy, so I went to see him, and we talked privately, and he said, you're going to have an escape attempt at 8:30 tomorrow morning. They're going to try it at this precise location. And next morning, the captain and I set up, and here 3 guys come right at 8:30, cross the area, tried to cut through the fence, and we apprehended them. And I waited for weeks, and finally I said to Billy, why did you do that? He said, I like the way this place is run. Simple as that. He knew he was going to be doing a long time. He liked it. When his parents would come, they were just like George and Barbara Bush, the first president. His dad was a very successful businessman in Georgia, and they had wonderful Southern hospitality. They were friendly. But every time I talked to them, I noticed the sadness in their eyes. And I wondered, what did they say to Billy when they went back? Their brother was involved in this gang of 54 murders, and he had been successful. He had been a U.S. Army Ranger. He had been a fireman in Atlanta, Georgia, and he had been in the car business. what did they talk about? And I just thought about that over and over again. What do you talk to your son about that's involved in, and those, I saw headlines in Georgia papers that we got sent to us that Billy Davis headline, murder. And they murdered a lot of innocent people. They didn't murder other criminals. The next thing that happened with Billy is, do you remember Lowell Lundstrom? They were kind of an evangelist on television, and his family, and they sang, and they were wonderful singers. They were coming, they were from Sisseton, South Dakota, I believe. They were coming back through here, and he called me and said, we would like to put on a little concert and a spiritual service for the inmates. So set it up on Friday afternoon, and Lundstrom family came, and they were beautiful singers, and then Pastor Lundstrom started to preach, and he told them he was going to preach on redemption. We probably had 70, 80 prisoners sitting in the bleachers, and he said, as he got into his talk, he said, I want all of you to close your eyes and keep them closed. And he continued to talk about redemption, and he said, those who want to be saved from their sins, please stand. And I saw Billy Davis slowly rise. I was stunned. I would be reading 6 murder indictments. He was giving me information. And here he was asking forgiveness for the crimes he committed. It was stunning. But it wasn't only Billy Davis. We had people from the mafia. We had Frankie Sacco from the Genovese family in New York City. And Frankie was in charge of extortion rackets. Everybody know what extortion is? I say to Dave Nix, I'm going to protect your house. And, yeah, you need to pay me a little bit. And Dave says, I don't want to do that. So Frankie would send some guys over and break Dave's legs, and then Dave would pay us from then on. And so Frankie came out to rodeo practice. He was 51 years old, good shape, and I said, Frankie, would you like to ride a horse? Oh, yeah, I'd like to ride one, but I said, don't worry, I'll put you on a horse. And there was a thick buckskin, bucked about that far off the ground, the back end. And so we were having practice, and I said, Frankie, come on over, I got a horse for you. He rode the horse, rode it down the end of the arena, bucked about that high. And I remember Frankie come running back, and he said, he was just grinning and laughing, and I thought he had just won the state basketball tournament by shooting a three-pointer. And so we learned a lot from these people, but we gained a lot. We got paid for their daily presence there. They sent education and recreational and enhancement funds, but the very best thing is they opened their training facilities in Glencoe, Georgia, to all of our officers. So all we had to do is pay for plane tickets to Glencoe, Georgia, and they got the best correctional officer training in the United States. So why did I leave the prison at age 45? And I'm going to tell you. One afternoon, 2 years before I even thought about leaving, I was sitting at my desk. It was a beautiful, sunshiny day, and I got an epiphany. I turned and looked out the window and said, you need to look for something different. And it stayed with me. And one of the things that not many people would know, and I don't know if it's the same way, but at that time the warden was appointed for 2 years only. And if another governor came in, he'd say, I'm not going to appoint him, I'm going to appoint somebody else. He would be out of a job. And About the same time, a friend of mine in the prison business sent me a study on prison administrators' life, their length of life expectancy. It was 59 years old. And I worked, and Barb will attest to this, I worked 2,800 hours a year, and my family was growing up, and I was missing my family. But the last thing I want to do with you is share some things I learned being a prison administrator. First thing was about decision making. The best decision is always the hardest one. It takes the hardest work to implement that decision, and it's usually the most distasteful. And people come up with rationales. Well, we could do this, and they have really good rationales, but you know in your heart that's not the right one. You have to do the hard one, and the hard ones always turn out to be successful. If you accept the rationales, they don't turn out to be successful. One of the things I learned was work with self-evident truths that are based on fact. And there's lots of emotions that happen with things happening in a prison. And you get people come to you that are emotional, and they start to spew out things, and you don't know what the facts are. So you have to remove the emotionally people from your presence, and you have to focus on the facts so you can make your decisions. Follow up what you say. When I walked through the prison and talked to the officers and the inmates, I carried a little notebook, and if they asked a question I didn't have an answer for, I told them I'd get back, and I made a practice to get back to them within 2 days. And built credibility. You face a lot of crises, and I quickly learned that when a crisis happens, physical things happen, that you need to move quickly. You can't ponder a situation. You need to take action. And one of the practices I had when something was happening, I wanted to be present in that situation. I wanted to be part of resolving those physical confrontations. One of the things that I'm thankful for, all my grandparents came from Norway. They were Stoics, and it helped me stay calm. I got that heritage inside of me. One of the other things I learned that there's a lot of adrenaline pumps in prison work. Your adrenaline surges up. Woo, you're filled with adrenaline. You talk too much. You're ready for whatever comes up. And you have to learn how to control that. And being deputy warden or warden, I learned that once the incident was over, I had to get away from everybody else because you naturally talk too much. And I wasn't in the position that I could be talking about things, so I would go off someplace quiet until the adrenaline settled down. One of the things making decisions I learned is examine everything, the truths and the non-truths. What is making this true and what is making this false? And sometimes, especially with sociopathic inmates, the non-truth sounds a hell of a lot better than the truth does because they're that persuasive. So you have to learn how to examine everything. And the last thing that I learned, everybody has their limits. After we started the construction, and Arnie and I both worked endless hours, you have to know when you're getting close to the abyss and you could step over it. You could make the wrong decision because you're wearing out. The last thing I thought about was I could thank God daily for the challenges that were presented, and his unseen hand was always present in my life. So thank you for this time. I appreciate you listening to me. And first time I've been able to tell about my 14 years in the administration. Thank you.
Got time for questions?
I wouldn't think anybody would have one. Yes, Mike.
I had the pleasure of working for you for many years. I was a Bismarck State College Kurtz Rental professor.
Yes.
So I went out there for several years.
I remember you.
Yeah.
We had to lock you up
That's
sometimes.
yeah. Getting out of there was a problem. I taught in the old cell block area. I remember that big brass key. I used to lock
Yes.
myself in my classroom, which was an experience. Some of the best students I had were out there. Case of wasted minds.
Yes.
I think I did well because I treated them as students first and inmates second. And that's the best way to do it. I had an experience that told me a little bit also about the prison, and not the administration, but the staff. I've been teaching there for about a year and a half, and I always prided myself that if they took my class, Western Civ 1, and they got released and took Western Civ 2, that would be the same class, same tests. And one of my better inmates came to me one day and said, "Mr. McCormack," he said, "yeah," he says, "our guard says that you're watering down the course that we're too dumb, and that in essence they're using our tax money, and I have to pay for mine." And he was sincere. He says, "Is that right, Mr. McCormack? Are you teaching this down for us?" I said, "No, I'm not." I said, "The test I give you, which you all hate, essay examinations, that's the same one they give at the college." And a couple of years later, I had a couple of inmates that I had in the prison, came to BSC out there. I talked to them after class. I said, "What do you think?" And they said, "Same damn tests." Secondly, there are inmates that did well that I see in Bismarck, good businessmen, and a credit to the community in every way. And there's some I never wanted to see outside.
Yeah.
I had Mark Allen Wells in class.
Yeah.
And a bright man. If there's ever such a thing as a person with dead eyes,
Yeah.
he was one of them. On the other hand, some of them were just great guys and friends. The prison rodeo. Photography is my hobby, and inmates found out about it. And they said, "Mr. McCormack, our families don't have any pictures. Would you come and shoot the rodeos?" Remember, I used to go there, and they set a little thing right above the bull chute there. And I had motorized Nikon, and I'd shoot, especially, they loved it when they were getting bucked off and stuff like that, and for their families. And I said, I'd be glad to do it. Those French photographers showed up, you just mentioned. Those are some dudes.
Yeah.
Oh, I tell you, they started talking. I said, well, these are the stuff that's really good to shoot. I said, the bull is the best stuff, I said. And they said, "Okay, you tell us when." And as I was shooting them, as the bulls kicked them off, I was shooting, looked down, the idiot Frenchman's down there in the pit, shooting pictures. And I said, "Well, I'm going to take pictures of him, not them, because he's going to get killed."
Yeah.
And so, I gave the inmates pictures. I did that for years, and it was a good experience for them, and it was something they appreciated. And lastly, I had an inmate one summer who was going to get out that summer. And he said, "Mr. McCormack, I'm going to get married in a month, and would you shoot our wedding?" And I said, "Well, sure, why not?" It's at the Burley County Courthouse, sure, at 2 o'clock or something. So I showed up, and Bert Riscall was a good friend of mine. He said, "What are you waiting for?" I said, "Well, I'm shooting a wedding." He said, that wedding?" I said, "Yeah." In comes the bride, beautiful dress, got a couple of bridesmaids, a mother. In walks my ex-inmate in bib overalls and cowboy hat and cow poop on his and I said, and it was a nice little ceremony, charming. I shot it, and I gave him the roll. I said, "Here, please, my gift, please get it processed someplace good and published." Anyway, about a year later, I got a piece of mail, and it said, "Prison historian teacher, Bismarck Junior College." And I said, "Uh-oh." I opened it up, and out came a $100 bill, a little note saying, "We're still married, Jim and Mary."
Oh. You know, you talked about that key, and remember you had to go from the education area over into the old cell house. And a guy was getting out, and he asked to see me. And he reached into his pocket, and he pulled out, and he had made a key out of aluminum. And he used that to go back and forth. And I never checked out a key out of the control room because I used that key to go to the gymnasium after that.
Creative.
Yeah.
How many years did they do the prison rodeo, and when did that end?
It went 14 years and it ended in 1987. It ended 1 year after I left.
Liability problems as part of this, as I recall.
Yeah. Dave?
Winston, I don't know this stuff, so can you help me see the difference? And I assume there are some differences between a state prison and a federal prison. Or is the federal prison simply fewer in number, larger in size?
You don't pay your tax, you're going to go to federal prison, Dave. But there are federal crimes. Kidnapping is a federal crime. Taking a motor vehicle, stealing it, and taking it to another state is a federal crime. Bank robbery is a federal crime. All kinds of organized crimes have been set up as federal crimes. So, yeah, there's a whole array of federal crimes. Paul?
Tell the story about Ambrose Champagne when he stole the truck.
When he stole what?
He stole the truck and he got drunk. He was on the two-way radio.
I wasn't there then.
Huh?
I wasn't there then.
Ambrose Champagne?
Well, yeah, I knew Ambrose, but that didn't happen when I was there.
Oh, it didn't?
No.
The old timers say that he was on the two-way radio and says, "Come get me, I'm drunk," you know. And so everybody working that night thought, "Oh, somebody's fired," you know, because you know, I mean, only staff can use these trucks. And we took the truck, and they went to pick him up, and as the story goes, is you were taking him into the penitentiary, and Ambrose says, "I'm going to kick your ass, Winston," and all you did was turn around to him and say, "Now, Ambrose, you're not going to kick my ass."
No, that didn't happen to me, but
It's a good story, though.
but Ambrose was the toughest guy I ever knew in my life.
He's a good cowboy, wasn't he?
One time I asked him, I said, "Ambrose, how many people do you think you've knocked out?" And Ambrose didn't talk too much. He said, "Oh, I think 200. And
But who's counting?
yeah, who's counting? And he was a tough guy.
Talk about Lamar Myers a little bit.
Lamar ran our beef operation, and Lamar actually helped us start the rodeo. He came over, and when we first started having practices, Lamar and I'd go out and round up our leased bucking horses and bring them into the prison. And Lamar ran the beef operation, which was west of Mandan, and Lamar treated those cattle like they were his children. I don't know if I should tell you this story, but we had a horse trailer, and we would haul cattle from over there to our pastures east of Bismarck. And so a guy, Lamar had a trailer load of cattle, and the guy gets up and slams on the brake, and Lamar has to, and all the cattle came. And he did it again at the next stop sign, like he was going to go through, and then he slammed on the brake. And the third one, he came up, and he did it again. So Lamar goes up there, knocks on his window, and it was a young kind of hippie guy. Lamar never said anything to him, but he hit him in the nose. And Lamar came to my office, and I noticed there's blood sprayed all over his shirt. And he said, "Winston, I've did something that's not very good." And I looked at him, and I said, "Why don't you and I go for a walk?" And so he told me what happened. And I said, "Lamar," and Lamar was probably one of our most valuable employees. I said, "Lamar, if we don't ever hear anything about this, we're going to forget about it." And we never heard anything about it.
He died sober.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Many years.
Yeah.
Mr. Satrom. I don't think Winston mentioned this, but we lived right at the prison all those 14 years. There was a deputy warden's house, a warden's house, and a couple of mobile homes. So his job was 10 yards away. So when he was called, he was right there. It was quite an interesting life. And you didn't say that you rode at the rodeos. He got on a horse.
I rode bulls and horses and got in wild horse race.
Yeah, we did.
The penitentiary was never the same after you left.
Oh, thank you. Improved, huh?
Are you kidding me? Top Howard?
I agree. How many inmates were there when you were the warden, and then how many
I think there were 466,
is considerably more now?
1,700.
1700?
You should know all their families and all their names.
Did I know? I spent a lot of time behind the walls, yeah.
Winston, I remember when I started teaching there, the comment that old Garderbring, I think, I talked to, and he said that the experience of higher education was a positive thing, because he said those who at least attempt to go to college, the recidivism was less. And that's why I always sort of felt good, because in some ways, even if they didn't get out of there or didn't even pass a course, maybe they got something that enabled them maybe to get the hell out of there and come back into society.
It opened up a bigger world to them, Mike. They all of a sudden said, this book, it's opened up something for me. So they started to think differently. Yeah, Paul.
Tell a funny Jack Paul story.
Oh.
I do Jack. A lot of funny stories about him.
Jack was our programs director, and he was a tremendous director. He was bright, but he probably was one of the most profane people that we've ever met in our life. And I actually can't tell you stories about Jack. You agree, Ingrid? I'm going to decline that request, Paul.
I was shocked when I was introduced to that.
Yes. There was nobody spared from Jack's profanity. And he didn't even notice it. That was
Second nature.
yes. I will tell you one little story.
100 inmates initially? And
1,700, yeah.
what do you think is the reason for that big?
Oil boom had a big impact on that. The oil development has had a big impact. Wanda might be able to tell us more. Drugs, yes. Yeah. I'm totally against recreational marijuana, and I can't tell you all the reasons for that, but it's not good. And it leads to using more and more drugs. And who's bringing the drugs up here? The Mexican cartels. We aren't immune to that. And I read an article in the Billings Gazette, and Highway 94 is called the drug pipeline that comes all the way up from Mexico, across Montana, and I've become acquainted with a captain of detectives in Billings, and they arrest 10 people a week on meth and heroin charges in Billings. And if you think about that, and they're usually associated with other crimes, that's about 40 people a month just going to prison out of Billings. One city in Montana. Okay, thank you very much.
I loved every minute of it. I loved every minute of it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, just a couple of announcements. We do have some cookbook